Hello, everybody. This is Brian from Breaking Down Security. This week is part 2 of our interview with Miss Ian Coldwater. She came on and discussed Kubernetes security with us, so we got to find out about how vulnerability management and everything worked with regards to Kubes, how they're set up, some basic architecture last 2 weeks ago. So if you are interested in listening to that interview portion about that, you can go back a couple episodes and listen. This week is part 2 and the finale of the episode. We get into a little bit of how to upgrade the system. We discuss some DevOps related topics, and we start with the question you're going to hear as soon as I finish talking. I ask her about a specific scenario. So have a great week, and we'll talk to you again soon. All right, so you're a brand new red teamer, as you said. I've hired you to come in because we have requirements to do third-party pen tests, and I have a major Kubernetes, implementation here. And I think I've done a fairly good job of, securing the environment according to, what my developers say. And as a red teamer or a person who's going to be, running pen tests against us, put your third-party pen tester hat on. What would be the first thing you would look at in the environment to attempt to embarrass me?
It's funny, this is very relevant to my work life right now.
Oh, goody.
Okay. The first thing I'm going to look at is the very first thing, what version of Kubernetes are you running? Are you running 1.5? If you're running 1.5, basically you have a door with not only no doorknob, but no hinges. That is going to be a very fast pen test.
Okay.
We're now up to, I think 1.13 is in beta, 1.12 is the latest version. So this is some time ago. But 1.5 had one user role. That user was admin. Absolutely everything was by default exposed, authenticated, role-based access control hadn't been introduced yet. Everything was just, you can do that pen test, within a cup of coffee,
Okay.
The likelihood is you're not running 1.5, but that would be the first thing I would look at is, how open is this likely to be based on version? The second thing that I would look at would be, okay, what, are you rolling your own? In which case, some of those defaults, frankly, you're going to be more likely to screw up. Are you on a public cloud? In which case, the different public clouds have different defaults, but you're going to be more likely to subject to those. Are you using any kind of third-party stuff attached to that installation? If you're using Helm, is there Helmtiller involved? Helmtiller is a notorious tire fire of a security hole. I would probably jump on that pretty quickly. I would probably go from there. So okay, how open is this likely to be just off the top? Assuming that, you might have some defaults on. Do you have those on? What are those likely to be? Do you have anything that is just a notorious mess? And then from there, what does this particular surface look like? Are there certain patches that have been applied? Are there certain services that are running? Do I have access to the wider internet? Do I have access to kubectl, which is the kind of CLI controller for Kubernetes? Can I download certain kinds of tools to it? And I would probably move from there. As much as Kubernetes, seems like a big complicated thing and is a big complicated thing, and as much as some of those analogies are hard to make, in terms of workflow for a pen test, it doesn't look that different than any other pen test. You enumerate it, you see if you can move around the network laterally, you see if you can escalate your privileges. A lot of that works out pretty similarly.
Does it have, is it easy to implement two-factor?
You can. And
it doesn't come standard, check a box and there you go?
That's going to depend pretty widely on what version you're running and what kind of installer you're running, because the thing about Kubernetes is that there are so many different flavors, right? So, you could be doing it on are you doing it out of public cloud? In which case, which public cloud? All of those installs are going to be a little different. There's commercial installations like Red Hat OpenShift that is going to be a little different. Are you just rolling your own from core? It's hard to answer questions like that because maybe there's a checkbox, maybe not. It depends where you are, but certainly that can be done.
So the API that you use, you can actually harden the API that people interact with to allow for OAuth or two-factor or something. Are there any? So you mentioned the Red Hat version, something in the cloud, GKE or in GCP. Are there any that you would suggest people to avoid? You mentioned using version 105 of Kubernetes.
1.5.
I'm sorry, 1.5. Apologies.
No.
Are there any that you would suggest avoiding, or ones that have come up recently that have been like major leaps, like, going from XP Service Pack 1 to Service Pack 2? That was kind of a huge shift in security for Microsoft. Is there any that have gone like crazy good? I mean, you mentioned 1.12 for Kubes, but is there anything,
Okay, so sub 1.6, you really ought to be updating. Honestly, even if you're running 1.6, you really ought to be updating. That's really before they started adding security stuff pretty much at all. 1.8, I think, was a pretty big breakthrough in terms of adding more security tools and ability to harden. 1.12 just did a lot. That one came out before my DerbyCon talk and destroyed substantial parts of the attack surface, which was interesting as a speaker. 1.13, I think, will destroy more of it. But I would say if you're running, anything like 1.8 represented a pretty big threshold in terms of is your stuff a total mess versus can you do more with that? But really, the higher you go, the better. They have about a 3-month cadence in terms of major releases. They come out pretty often, and things are improving in real time. I mean, that security team is pretty great, and they're doing a lot. Cool.
So you said, oh yeah, you should upgrade if you're using 1.5 or 1.6. I'm flashing back to the days of, upgrading your Java, and, you have developers saying, oh, we can't upgrade our Java because of X. How difficult is it to upgrade your Kubernetes implementation if, let's say you are using 1.6? Well, we can't upgrade because of X. Are there any reasons why they can't upgrade from 1.6 to 1.13 or something like that?
Oh, I mean, that struggle is real, especially, in large enterprises where things tend to move pretty slowly. Maybe for process reasons, maybe for, the developers put this thing on and that has a breaking change reason. Totally, not everybody is or can run the bleeding edge, which is why I'm the higher you can go, the better. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you go with the one that came out a few weeks ago, but
right.
The higher up you can go, the better off you are. Even within, if you're running 1.8 or something especially, and this is why I emphasize 1.5 and below, where you couldn't even set up RBAC if you wanted to because it didn't exist.
Right.
RBAC is role-based access control. But the older you get, the more the defaults are going to be open. But there are still versions past a certain version that you can set that stuff up. It's just not necessarily going to be there by default, or it might be rougher in terms of what you're able to do. So if you can't upgrade, you can do your best to harden with the infrastructure that you've got. And, if there are issues like that CVE that I mentioned before with the subpath host mount, really do patch for that CVE. That CVE is incredibly nasty in terms of what an attacker is able to do with it. And that actually, though, is responsible for a lot of people not upgrading, or has been, because breaking subpath host mount did break a lot of the ways that people were relating Kubernetes to their hosts. That was a pretty serious breaking change for people because they couldn't mount things in the same way anymore. At the same time, that's a pretty big trade-off because you are taking a large risk if you're not patched for that. So, do your best. Not everything is perfect and not everything's going to be perfect, but, the more you can do within the abilities of the infrastructure that you have to harden it, the better.
Right. So according to, wow, okay, that's a larger 2017 number than I thought. So 2017, what is that? 1,002,101 allowed containers using subpath volume mounts to access files outside of the volume. I can see why that would be a problem. Yeah.
It represented a full escape into the host and being able to get root onto the host by default, which is pretty nasty as these things go.
So if you're using 1.6 and this comes out, you're going to be almost forced to upgrade to one of the later versions, right?
Well, you'd think, but there's plenty of people who didn't,
Okay.
And as I said, there's trade-offs, but if you can upgrade from that one, certainly at least patch for that if you can help it,
Okay. So as a security guy, as a former blue teamer, the first thing I'm thinking of is I need to make it so that people can upgrade regularly. What are some of the things that you should not, is there things that you should not implement in your Kubernetes to make it easier to do those upgrades? Because a lot of the stuff that I had issues with at previous positions, not just the last one I was at, because everybody seems to use Java, God forbid, and I don't know why. But, the reason they couldn't upgrade to other Java versions was because API specific to that version, or performance issues, or the build environment didn't work with the new version of Java. Like one of the last CPUs that Java had broke Cassandra builds, for instance, and Cassandra was a major part of our infrastructure. What are some of the things that as security people we should suggest that they shy away from implementing, or is that a fairly open-ended question?
That's a fairly open-ended question, but that's fine. Well, as security people, really be careful about Helmtiller. I mentioned that already, but it is Helm is a kind of like management platform for Kubernetes. It by default has to run with full privs in order to be able to work because it's a management platform. And because of the way that that's configured, it can go around pod security policies, role-based access control, like all of the sort of more modern things that you're able to put on a Kubernetes cluster in order to harden it, because it has to in order to be able to communicate with everything. If you can get access to Helm as an attacker, that is, that's a pretty big thing to have access to. That is also responsible for a lot of breaking changes, I think. Helm, but also like kind of like third-party plugins and different kind of management frameworks and things like that, because maybe that only works with a certain version of the API. Maybe there's just some underlying bit that's going to if all of your stuff depends on, I don't want to shout me out because I don't know off the top if this is going to be correct, but networking plugin by Acme Plugin Company, then if that breaks, that's going to be problematic for maybe your CI/CD environment or something like that. So I would say, keep an eye on what you're putting into your Kubernetes installation. If you need it, you need it. But do you need it?
Right. Right.
That would be probably my best open-ended answer. Okay.
So Tiller runs on, well, it says the default is 44.134. So if your environment uses or has a default port of the 44.134, then you're probably running Tiller in the environment. And, most blue teamers, they don't know a lot of what's going on in their environment. So if they're doing network scans or doing Nmap and they find that port, then maybe some investigation is needed. So that could probably be its own show. If anybody from Helm is listening, which they may or may not be, feel free to reach out, because I'd love to have a show talking about how to secure your stuff, if you guys have anything like that at all at your organization. Anyway, so according to the last slide, I think on your talk, you had a number of things, and one of them was advice securing Kubernetes is standard security advice. So I'm not exactly sure what that means. If it's, you said standard security advice, which is your second point was defense in depth and least privilege, which makes sense. But you said standard security advice. Maybe you could expand on that. You probably did in the video, but we could probably talk about it here.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I said that is like, if we talk about kind of exotic DevOps tools and, new architectures and how these things like, maybe the analogies don't always hold up, or like old ways of thinking don't always hold up. In a lot of ways, that's true. But in a lot of ways, the advice for how to secure your Kubernetes cluster are things that I think a lot of us have heard before, like, practicing defense in depth, following the principle of least privilege, segmenting your networks well, limiting communication to things that only need to be communicating, IP tables, firewall rules, like the things that like a lot of people are going to be like, well, yeah, I've heard that, don't leave your ports exposed to the open internet if you don't have to, like, change your defaults out if they're open defaults, things that like, that's not very exciting advice, but it's, it's needed advice, and it's clearly not a thing that everybody is always doing. So a lot of it is just like, getting your basics right, practicing your hygiene, and that can really go a long way in terms of reducing your attack surface in Kubernetes, as with lots of other things.
Right on. Is it possible to run those ports not being exposed? Could you run them on, say, a local interface and then connect to whatever it is you need to secure those? Is it possible to run those on a local host interface versus whatever other interface is available?
It absolutely is. Kubernetes contains the ability to make that happen. There are different controls that you can place on it, such as like node restriction and things like that, for like making it so you only, everything is communicating within the cluster, and things within the cluster are only communicating with what they absolutely have to. Okay. Kubernetes by design is, has pretty open, defaults, and then allows you a lot of granular control, especially with later versions, on how to deal with and secure that. And that can totally be done. It might be slightly complicated, and it might take some work on your part, but you can secure your Kubernetes cluster. It just might take a little bit of work. So
us securing it, though, is that going to take tools away from developers that, want to be DevSecOpsy / CI/CD or whatever? Is that going to make them sad because they're reducing functionality?
It might, and that might be a conversation that you're going to have. I mean, I think that there's often a struggle between people who want things wide open because it will make the thing work, and people who, are like, oh my God, please don't leave that open. That's an awful idea, and that's a thing wherever you go, I think.
Okay. Very cool.
So let's talk about metrics. Does it have performance metrics built in?
It can. And yeah, it absolutely can. And those are things that you can set up in there, and things that to some extent, come natively. One of the really great things about Kubernetes is the way that it deals with performance and the way that it deals with scalability and load balancing. It automates that and makes it, and works very, very well for what it does.
Betcha, you don't need performance, dude. You just keep standing up clusters until and kubelets until everything, is super fast. You don't need to worry about, getting the most out of your cubes. If it takes 4,000 kubelets to run something, then it does. So
then I can pay for that, right?
Right.
It's just money.
Yeah, it's just money. Yeah, VC people are flush with it. You know that. So yeah, that was one of the things that I was like, well, do you really need performance metrics in Kubernetes? Because you can just keep standing up cubes until you've done the job and as fast as it needs to be.
Well, but you still want performance metrics because, and this is me speaking back in my experience in DevOps, you still want to know what's happening in there, and if it's going well, or if it can be set up more efficiently, because there's different ways that you can set up your resource quotas, and, is your thing working? Like, there were times that, something would just be trying to access some resource that it would be having trouble with, and it would just be spinning away. You want to know those things. If you have no metrics attached and no observability, you don't know what's going on, and that's not ideal for anybody.
Yeah.
So were you able to see the Spectre and Meltdown patches after they were applied, and you see a performance hit there?
Okay.
Did that
yes,
happen?
we were able. Yes, we were able to see it. Our cloud provider that we were using at the time responded to that very quickly. We were concerned about the ways that that would affect performance and also the ways that that would affect costs in relation to resources and everything like that. It didn't end up being much of an issue, but it was a thing that definitely got discussed and that people were keeping an eye out for.
And the reason that Spectre and Meltdown is such a big deal is because a lot of this runs and utilizes the CPU in that case, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, the kernel is shared. So, you know, if I have your kernel for a single container, I have the same kernel as your host. I have the same kernel as the cluster. I have the same kernel as whatever host machine and cloud you happen to be on. And you know, in the case of Meltdown or something with public cloud providers, that's a horror show, right? You know, you can go in and it's multi-tenant. You can go into different customers. Like that's not great. So I think they were very interested in fixing that very quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
So on June 26th, there was a hyper-threading Intel-based CPU vulnerability that came out. Those are the kind of vulnerabilities that you would want to take and make priority when you've got vulnerabilities coming out that don't necessarily affect Kubernetes. I'd assume. Are there any other vulnerabilities that we'd have to be worried about and give higher priority than, say, some kind of Linux patch for libtiff or something like that? Are all processor or kernel-based vulnerability something that those with heavy Kubernetes installations be worried about?
I personally am really excited about nerding out about like side channel attacks. Like that's like my jam, although it's not actually immediately cloud-based. I just really like doing it. I mean, the thing about Kubernetes, right, is that because it shares all of those resources with the host, it's only going to be as secure as the host that it's on and the operating system that it's on. So anything that's going to be affecting host resources, kernel stuff, CPU stuff, like any of that, you're going to want to be concerned about because, that is going to affect your clusters and your containers and your environment. That said, what you can do about that might vary depending on what kind of environment you're running, right? Because if it's a public cloud, you can't fix that. That's on them, and you could hope that your public cloud provider is fixing their microcode or whatever they need, but you're not necessarily the person responsible for that. If it's your, if it's your host, if you're running it on premises, if it's your environment, absolutely, as an operator, if you're operating it, keep an eye on that, make sure that stuff is patched. If some other department is operating that, keep an eye on them, making sure they're patching it, because you want it to be able to be secure on those layers. That's part of defense in depth. Because if you aren't, if I have dirty cow on there, I have dirty cow on your cluster too. I have dirty cow everywhere,
right.
And vice versa.
Cool. Yeah. All right. So we had a couple of questions I asked because, we had this planned ahead of time. So I asked in our Slack channel if there were any questions for Ian, and Dave Sybuck, one of our moderators, came up with a few. I think we've answered a couple of them already, but I wanted to discuss. He mentioned asking about telemetry, best first step for having containers report information. My overlords want metrics, dashboards, which lead to useful metrics. So we talked a little bit about performance on that, which is great. Was there anything else you wanted to add on with regards to that, or before we move along?
Yeah, I think we covered that. I was not the person responsible for doing the metrics on our Kubernetes clusters at my last job. There was one person who was brilliant who did that, and so I kind of got to peek over his shoulder a little bit, but I wasn't the one who did it personally. But yeah, Elk Stack's great. Splunk is great. If you want security-related metrics in particular, there are third-party vendors who are very, very good at that. And, there are ways that you can set up metrics things through public clouds. GCP has a great one. I believe AWS has some stuff too that you can use. And so, those can be set up. It might take a little bit of configuring on your end, but that can be done.
Okay. He said, how do you threat model your containers? We talked a little bit about that as well. Has she ever, or how would she begin a tabletop exercise, a cross between threat model or disaster recovery walkthrough for container infrastructure?
Interesting. Okay. Check your think about either your threat model specifically or the Kubernetes threat model in general or some combination thereof. Are you tabletop exercising some script kiddie finding your thing on Shodan and coming in from the outside? Are you tabletop exercising some developer clicking on a phishing link and an attacker having their credentials and being able to get into the cluster from there? Are they threat modeling a compromised container within a cluster, which can happen either because an attacker is in a cluster having gotten there through some other means and compromised it, or because some CVE has happened that either affects something in the container or host resources. And then I would say, move from there in terms of what you're concerned about and how to deal with that. If you're concerned about container compromise, how are you dealing with the resources, either the code or the dependencies or, whatever in your containers within your clusters? How are you dealing with things being exposed potentially to external attackers? Are you working with your developers or other people who have access to these resources about, please don't click on that link, that's a bad idea? Or, have you considered that running this helpful Docker container from that helpful blog post, I'm doing scare quotes, but you can't see me, without actually knowing what's in it may or may not be a wise decision. Kind of developer education and things like that, I think could be really important for those things. Nice. And, figure out how you're going to get alerted about those things, how you're going to deal with those problems. Can you patch that thing? Are you, what are you going to do when those credentials get compromised? Are you rotating your credentials well? Like tabletop exercising, like kind of from there, like how you're going to deal with those problems or how you could potentially avoid them.
And disaster recovery, is there a way, if you have your own in your data center, a Kubernetes cluster, to take, if that data center somehow went down, is there a secondary that could be in communication with it, sort of like Big IP-ish, and just take over seamlessly? Does that have that built in?
Kubernetes itself has disaster recovery built in natively. It's sort of part of the thing that it does, that if your container goes down, Kubernetes will automatically spin up a new one. If it is on an on-prem data center and that entire data center shuts down, I have, I guess, not personally witnessed that, and I don't want to give anybody bad information. Right. I will say that generally speaking, containers go down all the time and will be spun back up. In that case, I don't know how that works, but I bet somebody does.
So what would you need to back up in your Kubernetes implementation to be able to, say, fail over to another server? I would assume just the etcd, right? You just need to be able to keep that, and then you would be able to recover somewhere else. So if you wanted to back that up offsite, how big is the etcd? I mean, with regards to size.
Kubernetes itself, I don't know that it needs to be etcd specifically. I mean, etcd is just, it's just a key value store. It's, just text, Oh,
okay. It's not very big then.
I mean, how much text is in there? I don't know.
Oh, okay.
But you can set Kubernetes up to do that. I know that a lot of people will use like hybrid clouds if they're doing like on-prem stuff, so that maybe it's backed up in the cloud somewhere. This I'm actually just going to say is out of my wheelhouse, and I don't want to give anybody bad info.
That's okay. I feel like there are people out there who are screaming, that I asked a stupid question there. So
no, I don't think it's a stupid question. I just don't want to give a bad answer. So.
Yeah, no. There's people out there that saying I just put out a stupid question. It's okay. I don't have a lot of experience with this, and I'm assuming that there's other people who don't have experience with this either. But there's CISO or there's CEOs like, I saw this at RSA, so we definitely want to do Kubernetes or Netties. So cool. So the last thing he asked a question of was the MITRE ATT&CK framework. There's a spinoff for mobile, I guess, that's being created. Do we need one for Kubernetes, Swarm, or DCOS? I don't know what DCOS is. Do we need a MITRE ATT&CK framework kind of thing for containers or Kubernetes?
You cut out for a second. And
I'm sorry. Do we need an attack framework for Kubernetes or containers, just like we have for regular network-based attacks?
I think having an attack framework is generally a good idea. If somebody wants to make one, I'm not going to be opposed to that. There are things out there that that do give you an idea of like, there's a product called KubeHunter that's open sourced by Aqua that, you know, allows you to like simulate pen tests according to like known attack surfaces on a cluster that you should not run against, that are on clusters that are not yours. There are products that can measure your clusters against like the CIS benchmarks and stuff like that. So there are some frameworks for that. I'm not going to be opposed for anybody making a MITRE ATT&CK framework for that.
Right.
That specifically, to my knowledge, doesn't exist, but please make it and send it to me. That sounds great.
Very cool. All right. Mr. Boettcher, do you have anything else you'd like to ask Ian before we go?
Well, or in the attack framework, they could have more examples of what this particular attack would look like in a Kubernetes environment that may be, I guess, more reasonable for them, at least at first, than to develop an entire framework for it.
Right.
I mean,
but yeah, like you said, go ahead. Oh, like you said, it's what's old is new again, right? All the attacks, I guess the mindset of pen testing and attacking is pretty much universal, right?
In a lot of ways,
take care of your creds. Don't give out your passwords to people, right? And be careful what you click on because they might steal them or whatnot. The same rules apply.
Yeah, they do.
That's all. That's all I have to say about that.
That said, there are. I have discovered as a newer pen tester that there are very few tools out there for pen testing Kubernetes. They just don't really exist yet because so few people are doing it. So if anybody out there who's listening is good at making tools and is feeling inspired, there's lots of room for opportunity there for things to be made. So yeah, there is that.
Don't worry, the PowerShell Empire, idea for Kubernetes will come out, and then it'll be like, oh, everything's cool, and you'll have. It'll be the Metasploit for Kubernetes, and then you'll be fine. And
there are a few of us who have talked about building that. Maybe at some point that'll happen.
Wow. So one last thing I was just thinking about, because we were talking about the attack matrix and lateral movement came in. If you're able to get into one cube, does that necessarily mean you have access to all the cubes, or do you how does lateral movement work if you haven't broken out of the cubes yet?
Okay, so again, if cubes here are representing containers, this sort of depends on how the cluster has been configured, because especially in older versions when there was just no restriction within the network or what could talk to what at all, if you're in one container, you're in the cluster, you're everywhere. Lateral movement in a cluster context can work both horizontally, in terms of being able to move from one container to another container or to different parts of the cluster, and also vertically, in terms of moving to the host or to the public cloud. And so there's a few different ways you can do that. It can absolutely be configured so that you can't do that. Using node restriction, using RBAC, using different pod security policies can affect movement, as well as being able to escalate your privileges or not, or how you might do that. There's a lot of ways to harden it up. The question in terms of, lateral movement is, have those been done? How have they been done? Because if they've been done well, you can't get anywhere. If they haven't been done at all, or if they've been done badly, you can go pretty far. And that is going to be variable on every cluster and how it's configured.
Cool. Excellent. All right. Well, now I really don't have anything left, or if I do, I'll remember it a couple hours in the future. Oh, I probably should have asked that question. Damn it. But for now, I think I'm okay. Mr. Boettcher, how about you?
Good.
Doesn't this just make you want to spin up a whole big implementation at your office there, Mr. Boettcher?
Oh, yeah. And get a crappy implementation going, right?
You should get some of that tiller. Get some of that tiller and put it on there, too. That'll be great.
It's like in the old days when you set up a database, the default admin username and password were rarely changed. And so pretty much if you knew what kind of database it was, you could get admin access just because no one changed those.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's it's still I want to say it's still fairly new technology, but what Kubes has been around for almost 8-10 years now?
No, it first came out in, I believe, I want to say 2014. It might be 13.
Really?
But it's pretty new tech.
Oh, okay. Well, within the last 5 years then. Okay. That's cool.
Things move fast.
Yeah, it does, don't it? Well, I mean, we've been dealing with containers and jails and shroots and stuff since, way back in the day. So this it seems like this is a logical, progression of that whole restriction technology where it's, you're restricting things. First, Solaris was doing it with zones, and then, BSD was doing it with jails and shrooting on OpenBSD. And then, you had your, VMs and containers, and now you've got this. So, it's only moving further and further down the road. So we just have to figure out how to secure it. So, yeah.
Okay. So what's the advantage of setting up a Kali cluster
or a kubelet?
There is a Kali Docker container that I think is official, and I think that it is pretty lightweight and you can easily spin it up pretty quickly, I think is why people might want to use that. Also, I think I know of at least one person who containerized Kali because she could. The Kali image that I know of is very, very lightweight. Like, it really just contains the few most used tools and not all of the things. I know that you don't need Kali to pen test a Kubernetes cluster. The things that make sense on Kali do not necessarily make sense in that context, and the things that you might need in that context are not going to be available to you on Kali. And so I think mostly the advantage to that to containerizing it itself would just be the lightweightness of it, not necessarily that you would need it to do this particular thing.
Cool.
So it's more like just a cool thing to do.
I think so. Yeah. And you could spin it up fast.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Cool. All right. Well, I think we're done. We went way over our time. We'll probably have to turn this into a two-parter, only because there's just so much information in here. Ian, how would, I know we mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but just for part 2, how would people get a hold of you if they wanted to discuss Kubernetes security or, congratulate you on your new job as a red teamer?
Oh, thank you. I tweet at Ian Coldwater, which is my name, Coldwater, like temperature water.
Right on.
And my DMs are open. Feel free to reach out anytime. Might take me a minute to respond, but I'll be stoked to hear from you. Just, be nice, please.
Right on. Yes.
And thank you all so much for having me on. It's been great.
Yeah, cool. So you're not speaking anymore this year, you said, but you're working on your, speaking circuit schedule for 2019, right? So if anybody wants you to come and talk or keynote or something like that, you're available.
I hope that I'm available. Please reach out. I'll try to figure it out. Fantastic.
Okay. Very nice. So I actually tweeted out that, we're getting schooled on Kubernetes. So that was very interesting. We're already getting people who are liking that.
Cool.
So did you mention at the first of the episode who you work for? Because, it just seems like if people have issues with Kubernetes or want to pen test their Kubernetes implementation, your company might be available to do that. So do you want to give them a shout out?
Totally. I work for a company called Red Team Security. It's a little company in St. Paul, Minnesota. I believe redteamsecure.com, I think. And definitely we would be excited to pen test your Kubernetes clusters. I in particular would be excited to do that. So please send them my way.
Right on. Okay. So Mr. Boettcher, if people wanted to discuss with you any LogMD or logging or, BDIR, which is our other podcast, Breaking Down Incident Response, if they wanted to talk to you about any of that, how would they do that?
Well, we got a pretty awesome Slack channel.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Join, of course. But you can read about me on log-md.com or hit me up on Twitter at BoettcherPwned, my last name, BoettCherpwned.
Yep. Yeah, speaking of the Slack, we have a specific channel for containers and VMs and stuff, and I'll probably rename it to include something about K8s or Kubernetes. We have a lot of people on there who talk about distributed systems. We have people who are interested in doing that kind of stuff. So if you are interested and have a passing fancy about SIM and logging or IAM and 2FA kind of stuff, or looking for a job perhaps and need help with your resume review, you can definitely send us a DM on our BreakSec Twitter, which is @BreakSec, BRAKESEC, and we'll hook you up with an invite to that. We don't allow open joining because we're worried about bots and stuff or people who would be evil. Or you can send us an email, bds.podcast@gmail.com, and we'll send you an invite. So you can follow Ms. Berlin, who is sadly, of course, not here because she's in Germany giving a version of her mental wellness village that she did at DerbyCon, which very, very deserving of a black badge, which she got at Derby. You can talk to her on our Slack. She's available there, or you can follow her on Twitter at InfoSystir, INFOSYSTIR. And you can follow me on Twitter. I'm Brian Brake, BRYANBRAKE. And we're have a very active Slack, almost 1,600 accounts, 500 active users regularly, actively going through our 10K message limit on Slack, sadly, every week. So, we're very active. We have a social contract, so, we expect people to be nice to one another when they're in the Slack. But, if that's that's the only real requirement we have, just be nice to one another, and we don't talk about politics. So feel free to join us on there. So we have a Patreon. We are a listener-supported podcast, first and foremost. At least BreakSec is. BDIR does employ sponsors, but BreakSec is always free, and it's listener-supported. So if you found enjoyment in the last couple episodes here with Ian, please feel free to drop us something in the tip jar. A couple of bucks helps out with hosting, Zoom, paying for the Zoom, which we also use for our book club and our CTF club. All of it's very much appreciated. So thank you for doing that. We're on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Store, TuneIn Radio. I find it very interesting that I can listen to my own podcast inside my Tesla 3 because they use TuneIn Radio for instead of like XM for streaming audio. But very excited to see us on Spotify in those areas. And if you want to listen to the show, we're on iHeartRadio. There's pretty much no place you can't find us. We also have an RSS feed if you want to put us in your favorite podcast catcher. I don't have anything else. Mr. Betcher, are you speaking anywhere?
No, I'm not speaking anywhere.
Okay. Well, you should. Mr. Goff doesn't have to, have the spotlight the whole time. So, lastly, again, I want to thank Ian for joining us. It's been very enlightening. Feel free to come back if you have anything else you'd like to discuss in the Kubernetes realm. Thank you for teaching me how to say Kubernetes properly, even though I flubbed it a couple of times there. So, I almost got you off, let go without saying it. I had a lunch with Mr. Kaki, Danny, and he said you give some of the best hugs that he's ever had. So he said to definitely send his best regards to you when I had lunch with him. So, all right.
He gives great hugs too.
I'll definitely send him a message for that. He was up here in Seattle with me, and I had lunch with him, so it was a pleasure seeing him. So, cool. So that was it for Breaking Down Security this week. Be nice to one another. Please take care of yourself because you're the only you have, and we will talk to you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.